Hi, this is Remembering the Past, the show where we talk about people who died recently who've had a profound effect on our history, our society, or our culture. Tonight we're going to start out with our feature, Louis Zamperini, who died recently at the age of 97. He was born out east, but he moved to Southern California when he was a young man and he became a track star, the Torrance Tornado. He ran at USC and he was good enough to make the 5,000 meter team in the 1936 Olympics. He finished 8th, but he got to meet Adolf Hitler, who was impressed by his finish. But Louis Zamperini's story was far more than that. He was a war hero in World War II and then became a prisoner of war, then an inspirational speaker, and finally a legend due to Laura Hillenbrand's superb book, Unbroken. Here from Memorial Day 2012 is CBS Sunday Morning with a report on Louis Zamperini.
Louis Zamperini's story was pretty much ancient history. An elderly man waving in a parade, until a best-selling book reminded the world of his harrowing tale. His first fame came when he was just a teenager. In 1936, he made the U.S. Olympic team. At 19, he was the youngest qualifier in the 5,000 meters. He didn't win, but Louis Zamperini became a household name, a sports hero. A few years later, the nation was at war. Zamperini was a bombardier in the Army Air Corps. On this very day, 69 years ago, his B-24 crashed into the Pacific.
Our number one engine, the RPMs dropped. This plane was barely flying with 4 motors, and with 2 gone, it just dropped like a rock. And so we hit the motor nose down. I felt like someone hit me in the forehead with a sledgehammer. The plane was completely blown apart.
What happened next was documented in this 1998 story from correspondent Bob Simon.
Zamperini spotted a life raft floating rapidly away from the burning waters. He swam to it.
47 days in an inflatable raft.
We never prayed before, but on a raft you pray like a foxhole.
He fought off sharks.
This shark was so big that he could have taken one bite and he could have bitten that raft in 2.
And battled the sea.
I was in a violent storm. I never seen anything like it.
Things went from bad to worse. Zamperini was near death when he was captured by the Japanese and taken to a place known as Execution Island, where every known prisoner had been put to death.
They took great joy in telling us we were going to be executed, and they'd always go through the motion.
It got even worse. His fame back home led to hours of torture and beatings at the hands of a sadistic guard nicknamed the Bird.
I couldn't bear to look in his eyes. I just couldn't do it. To me, they were that sadistic.
When he wasn't being beaten, he was starved, like most of the Americans held by the Japanese. But somehow, he survived. Louis Zamperini returned home a hero.
This is your life. Now,
there were TV appearances. His life appeared to return to normal. But the war years, while gone, were anything but forgotten. Haunted by nightmares, he turned to alcohol. Then, in a last-ditch effort to save his marriage and perhaps his life, Zamperini joined his wife Cynthia at a prayer service led by a young Billy Graham. Graham's sermon touched on the power of forgiveness.
It was the first night in 2 years and a half that I didn't have a nightmare, and I haven't had one since. The forgiveness, it was the complete healing factor in my life.
Which is why Zamperini decided to commit himself to a lifetime of forgiveness. And that meant he had to go back to Japan to see the prison guards who'd tried so hard to destroy him.
The most important thing in my Christian life was to know that I not only forgave him verbally, but to see him face to face and tell him that I forgave him.
That was 61 years ago, and our story would end there, were it not for the book, Unbroken.
This is the English version.
Here is Louis.
He's become a celebrity all over again. Readers clamor to see him,
And I said, no way.
to hear him, to applaud his life. When you finished reading that book, what did you think?
It put me back in prison. And I had to stop and look out the window to be sure I wasn't back in prison.
Did you ever imagine it would be a bestseller?
She's a great writer.
She is author Laura Hillenbrand. Her last book was the bestseller Seabiscuit. Unbroken took her 7 years to research and write. But in all that time, you may be surprised to learn that the author and the subject of her story never met, not even once.
That's real sad. We talk back and forth every week. The research, details. And even when I would tell her something, she would double check on it.
Hillenbrand never met him because she has chronic fatigue syndrome and finds it difficult to leave her home here in this neighborhood of Washington, D.C. So, as Zamperini did, we spoke with her by telephone.
Patients often go into times where they are literally unable to get out of bed for weeks or months or years. And it was something that helped me identify with Louis, because his story is largely about suffering.
Hillenbrand says she thinks not meeting Zamperini actually made her book better.
Because when he was telling me his stories, I wasn't looking at a 90-year-old man. I was thinking about a 17-year-old runner or a 26-year-old guy out on a life raft. And I was able to visualize it, I think, a lot better because I wasn't in the room with him. I think it enabled me to tell the story more fully that way.
But while Hillenbrand came to know nearly everything about Zamperini, he knew almost nothing about her.
When the papers printed her story, I couldn't believe it. The only thing I could do, and I felt was proper, I sent her one of my Purple Hearts, and I said, "You deserve this more than I do."
Why did you feel she deserved it more than...
Well, she's been suffering for 30 years. I suffered for a couple of years. I'd rather suffer intently for a couple of years than to have a long, drawn-out siege like she's going through.
Turns out the 45-year-old infirm author and the aging but vital veteran share much more than the past. Laura has said that when times get really tough for her, she calls you.
We talk to each other on the phone. People say, "Oh, yeah, Louis my inspiration." Well, I might say that she's my inspiration.
When Hillenbrand first sent Zamperini a copy of her book, she sent along this letter.
To have before me an example of someone who has overcome superlative hardships and emerged into a life filled with joy has been deeply inspiring to me at a time when I needed it most. I can't wait for you to read my book. I think you'll love it.
When we talked with Zamperini, he said he hoped one day to meet Hillenbrand, that he had a message.
Well, I don't think we'll tell each other very much except I love you.
Not long ago, that hope became a reality. While in Washington, he paid a visit to her home.
He told me as we were hugging each other and saying goodbye, he said that the book was the crescendo of his life, and he believes he's lived this long so he could see it written and read. And that was the loveliest thing he's ever said to me.
As for Louis Zamperini, he has something to share with all his newfound admirers. You forgave your Japanese enemies. Do you think Americans forgive enough?
No, I think that's the hardest thing in life, I think, is forgive. Hate is self-destructive. If you hate somebody, you're not hurting a person you hate, you're hurting yourself. That's a healing. Actually, it's a real healing, forgiveness.
Well, in closing, Louis Zamperini, I'd like to point out two things. His story is remarkably similar to that of Eric Lomax, whose podcast we did about 2 years ago. He was a British prisoner of war. He was tortured by the Japanese in Southeast Asia, suffered PTSD after the war, and went back to Japan to forgive his captors. They made his story, Railway Man, into a movie starring Colin Firth last year, and Louis Zamperini's story is scheduled for a movie to be released this year, directed by the Coen brothers. I'd also like to point out that a number of the obituaries on Louis Zamperini completely ignored Billy Graham's role in his life and his redemption after his bout with alcoholism, which I think is not fair because it is an important part. I'd like to move on now to Jim Brosnan, who died recently at the age of 84. He was a pitcher for a number of teams, including the Cubs, the Cardinals, the Reds, and the White Sox, but he's best known because he was one of the first, if not the first, baseball player to become an intelligent writer about the sport. His book, The Long Season, published in 1960, was a gentle but literate account of the underside of baseball and paved the way for later literate accounts by athletes of their sports, including Jim Bouton's Ball 4, which was a slightly racier book, and Pete Gent's books about professional football that we talked about when we did his podcast. Brosnan was born in Cincinnati, but he was drafted by the Cubs, and he moved to Morton Grove, about 15 minutes from where this podcast is taking place, and lived there for the rest of his life. He wasn't much of a pitcher when he started out, but he acquired two things as he moved up the ranks. First was a competitive instinct. It's interesting how a lot of these literate athletes actually do have a very, very developed competitive instinct. He developed his after getting bounced around the major leagues for a while. The other thing he developed was a great slider, and that helped him become a very good pitcher. Right when he was becoming a good pitcher, the Cubs got rid of him to the Cardinals. Does that sound familiar? And the Cardinals eventually let him go to the Reds, and he actually pitched on the great Reds team of 1961 that won the pennant, was beaten by the Yankees in the World Series. Frank Robinson was aware of his literate instincts and dubbed him the Professor. He wrote another excellent book about the 1961 pennant race called What Else? Pennant Race. He was actually one of the best relief pitchers in the National League. He had a good season in 1962, but guys with literate instincts weren't especially liked in clubhouses in those days, so they traded him to the American League to the White Sox. His salary at the time was considered onerous. It was about $30,000. Today, he'd be making about 200 times that. He had a good year for the Sox in 1963, but general manager Ed Short said he couldn't write during the season, and he didn't like that, so they let him go before the 64 season. The Sox lost the pennant race to the Yankees by one game in 64, so you got to believe that Jim Brosnan might have helped the Sox win the pennant that year. I have to believe he would have outpitched Frank Baumann and Frank Kreutzer in the bullpen. Anyway, he became a writer after that, based in Morton Grove, but he never really wrote anything as good as the long season in the pennant race after that. His legacy will forever be, from a literary perspective, how he changed the face of baseball and sports in general. I'd like to close tonight with Mike Hawker, who died recently at the age of 77, and he was a British songwriter. He was a lyricist, and he wrote the lyrics to two of the best-known British songs of the 1960s, one of which will be familiar to most Americans and the other won't. Those two songs helped make the careers of two of Britain's best female singers of the 1960s. The first was Helen Shapiro, who was a nice Jewish girl from London. She was sort of like Leslie Gore in that she was a big hit as a teenager in the early 60s. In fact, the Beatles looked up to her, and they were the backup group for her on one of her tours in 1963. They wrote Misery for her, which she never recorded. But in 1961, she had a #1 in England. It actually made the charts in the United States, but it only made it to 100 on the Billboard charts, and it was written by Mike Hawker. It's called Walking Back to Happiness. Very familiar in England, not too familiar here in the United States.
What loneliness can do since I've been away. I have loved you more each day, walking back to happiness. Whoop-ah, oh yeah. Said goodbye to loneliness. Whoop-ah, oh yeah. I never knew I'd miss you. Now I know what I must do. Walking back to happiness I shared with you.
That was the way those British songs sounded before the Beatles in the early 1960s. I'm going to close on that note. I want to thank my producer, Sid Tepps. But Mike Hawker's other song was a much bigger song, and it made the career of another influential British female singer. It was her first solo hit. That singer was Mary Isabel Catherine Bernadette O'Brien. She was a nice Irish Catholic girl from London who started out singing folk songs with her brother, including a hit version of Silver Threads and Golden Needles. But she wanted to go solo, and she had a great voice and a great delivery. She became better known as Dusty Springfield. In late 1963, she recorded a Mike Hawker song that had a nice Phil Spector type arrangement. It went to #4 in England and went as high as #12 in January of 1964 in the United States. In fact, it was one of only 3 songs that was on the American charts from the British invasion in January of 1964. The other 2 were I Want to Hold Your Hand and She Loves You. So Dusty Springfield was actually the second artist from the British invasion to come to the United States in early 1964, and it was with this song. The song has also been recorded by the Bay City Rollers, Samantha Fox, and Luis Miguel. But only one person does it like Dusty, and that's Dusty. So as a final tribute to Mike Hawker, we're going to play the song that launched Dusty's career, I Only Want to Be With You.